Good evening, everybody. We'll get started for tonight's meeting of the Community Advisory Group for Berkeley Lab, and we will pass the microphone around for self-introductions. Here we go, Sandy.
I'm Sandy. I'm with MIG.
Kirsten McDonald from the Berkeley Chamber of Commerce.
I'm Rich Sextro. I'm a community member and a retiree from Berkeley Lab.
Marcus Gondeta, a community member.
Thanks, Marcus. Liz Swift. I'm a neighbor and a scientist.
Jody Pincus with Rising Sun Energy Center, a local nonprofit.
Hi, Jen Tang. I'm the manager for federal and community relations at Berkeley Lab.
Good evening. I'm Michael Brandt. I'm the new COO at the Berkeley Laboratory, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm in my second full week in the job, so I'm in my sixth day. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So, and I'm Mike Witherell. I'm the lab director. Thanks everybody for being here. So let me pick up on that a little bit and say that it is we, as always, we're undergoing some major transformation at the laboratory, and including. So all of you have been working certainly with Glenn Kubiak, who's just hit retirement after 5.5 years on the job, and he was a superb chief operating officer and deputy director of operations. After he has a month away, we will bring him back for certain projects in the way that we do. And so, he's had a very special connection with this group, and from when he first came. So I want to say we had our search for to replace him, and so Michael's coming to us. He'll introduce himself, but coming to us from Los Alamos. And I want to say that this is an extremely important position for the laboratory, both because of our goal is to be as outstanding in operations in all of its parts as we are in research, and I think we're reaching that level. And you'll hear a lot of what you hear about is about the facilities that we're bringing online and so forth. So that's what we brought Michael in to work on. I will also say, to introduction, we have one other new person, John German, back there. He's head of strategic communications for laboratory. This is a somewhat reworked position for us. That is a reorganization to emphasize strategic communications in all fronts, both external and internal. So John's coming to us. He's coming to us from Arizona. And so we have a couple of people who are getting used to what rain is a little bit at the moment here. We're desert rats who are coming to the coast. Well, strategic communications means that it is advancing the mission of the laboratory is the simplest answer to that. And therefore it needs to be tied closely to what the strategy of the laboratory is. I will say one thing that's an important part of this is actually including improved internal communications with all the people of the laboratory, which in a distributed 4,000 person organization is extremely difficult. And so that's something that we're going to be putting a lot of effort on immediately. Okay, so there's some more than the usual introductions.
Excellent, very good. Thank you, Mike and Michael, and very nice to have everyone here on board. So for tonight, we will do our usual updating on the capital projects. Before we do that, though, Michael Brandt will have some comments regarding his role, and then we do have a couple of special presentations, one on the emergency management at the lab and a technical-oriented presentation using dark fiber to monitor the Earth's subsurface. So should be very interesting. And then we have CAG member updates. So we expect to maintain communication here.
Yeah, and actually, I will, and this might be the time to do it. I'm going to, because it's what people had always asked me about, I'm going to say a little bit about federal budgets and things. And so, because that's very important to laboratory and important to, so let me and I have no slides for this. In fact, these are things that are better off not on slides for the most part. So.
Did you want to do that now?
So should we, yeah, I think maybe I'll do
Yeah,
that
go
now. We've talked about this, as you know, a year ago, so the process on the federal budget is there's a president's budget request, and it goes to Congress. House and Senate pass appropriations. In principle, those get, there's a conference committee that puts those together, and they pass an appropriations law, which the president signs before October 1. That's only happened about 4 years in the last 25 that way. So what happens more is that they can't quite decide that. We're on a continuing resolution and all that. So, this year, fiscal year 18, we are still in a continuing resolution, even though we're not quite 6 months into the year. It turns out that the budget for the Department of Energy, the parts that fund research, was okay in fiscal year 17. We actually, in fact, at our laboratory, the fiscal year 17 total budget in was $949 million, which is actually a record for the laboratory. I don't put that out as a press release, but it's very good. I mean, I don't want to, and that's not because, that's not a single decision, that's 100 decisions on proposals and projects and so forth. So it basically says we're, and mostly out of flat budgets, that we're competing very well for those very competitive research dollars on a wide range of things, is what that means. It's literally hundreds of decisions that lead us to that. So that's a good basis for this continuing resolution this year, which is mostly based on that. On the other hand, the continuing resolution renewed every month is a lousy way to run any organization, because month by month we don't know where things are going to be. There are a couple of projects where the budget is supposed to be going up, where that doesn't happen as long as we're on continuing resolution, and people, it makes planning inefficient. It makes it frankly causes a waste of taxpayer money to have continuing resolutions. I think everybody who looks at this knows. So we are, we have good reason to believe there will be an appropriations bill that comes out in the public later this week, which is going to be sort of agreed on appropriations from the different subcommittees that will become public, and then they will go through the process of voting on this and trying to get it passed by March 23rd, when our continuing resolution ends. If they don't make that, they would extend by a week and try to make it by that. We know a lot about what will be in that bill for us, and it's actually quite good for us. In particular, things relevant that are individually big things for us are we have the cleanup work that we've talked about here, cleaning up the old sites so we can build new facilities and cleaning up them. We had hoped to get $21 million for environmental management cleanup work at the laboratory in this year. If they pass the bill that they now are passing around, it would be almost twice that. So that would be a really positive. It would help us get that work done faster, which would be great. We have a major project for the laboratory, the advanced light source upgrades, or our big facility, X-ray synchrotron advanced light source, which is one of the largest programs of the laboratory and one of the broadest programs of the laboratory. When I came in, we've been pushing along an upgrade to make that more intense. That would take $300 million. It would take over, it would be the biggest project of the laboratory since the advanced light source was built 25 years ago. And it would extend the life of that for another 25 years, more or less. We didn't know if that would get new funding this year, although we've been keeping it alive. They're talking about having $30 million of funding this year for that, which would be great. And that would actually And we're also on a path to go to our next level of approval on that by the summer. There are other things, but those are some of the big ones. So we're hoping very much that they will be able to pass. The thing that could defeat this, of course, is something happens that leads them not to pass a bill. And until that happens, we can't. And the last thing is the present budget request this year that came out for FY19, that is, starts the discussion for the following year. It still, if enacted, it would still have some cuts in it for laboratory budget. But the Office of Science part, which is our most basic research, is much better than the present budget request last year. And so the appropriations committees have much less work to do to restore it to what is really needed. And so the fact is, and the final stage, the final thing that just, we're now building in our biocampus, we're building the first of the buildings for the Joint Genome Institute. We've had plans to get ready to build the second building, which would be environmental biology, called BioEpic. And it's really a visionary program for us. And we've been waiting to see, getting it ready, but not knowing. And just in the last few weeks, we've been asked to get the materials ready for a mission need statement for that, which is the first level of approval. And in a record time, we went through a review of that and got a recommendation for approval. And that project would be a $140 million building, which would be the biggest this program's actually funded. So I have to say, we've had several fire drills lately, but they've been good fire drills. I mean, I have to be careful about that, but you know what I mean. I mean, things were all hands on deck, but they've been because of good news rather than crises. So I have to say that the morale around those things is much better. I won't be talking fully public about all these things until we get a bill passed, and so I really know that they're going to happen. But that's where we hope that they are headed.
But it might be the end of the month.
But it should be if it's not by the end of the month, I'm going to worry about whether it's going to happen at all. So this is something we should be hearing about in the next 1-2 weeks. Well, the way Politico is a good place to go. Let me say where I go, or either the Politico website or the Hill website. They post these things. That's the best sort of outsider publications for this. So I go there. Things you don't have to pay money for. That's about as good as you can do. And when they are, as soon as they're getting these things, they'll post information that's going on.
Okay, any,
I'm sorry?
That money comes out of BER?
Well, that's a good, the priority and the programs come out of biological environmental research, so as I decode BER.
Yep, I'm sorry.
But this particular funding line for these buildings is the Science Laboratories Infrastructure SLI program, which is specifically for this sort of infrastructure. But they get their cues on what to do from this. So they go to the laboratory, to the programs, and BER said, this is our highest priority next. And so they lined us up. And this is generally towards the idea that the word came down that the administration was open to have some infrastructure projects. And so they came up with infrastructure projects.
okay, any other comments from CAG or questions from CAG members? Okay, very good. Did you want to turn things over to Michael?
Well, good evening. Again, I'm pleased to be here, and I'll just describe a little bit about why I decided to join the Berkeley Lab, some about my background, and then what some of my initial plans are. What attracted me to Berkeley is I've had some interactions with Berkeley over the last several years, and it's uniformly the passion around the mission for the lab. Seeing scientists and engineers and operations staff come together and unify around ensuring that the laboratory can be successful, so that interdisciplinary teaming is really very important and was very appealing to me. And it is appealing because I've seen it work in the 2 weeks that I've been here. I've seen multiple examples of people coming from disparate professions and disciplines, technical disciplines, to come together to solve problems. Also, the laboratory's worldwide reputation for scientific excellence and leadership is also very appealing. That coupled with interdisciplinary teaming and the lab's ability to address and solve complex problems, to solve national problems and to solve worldwide problems in a range of areas is also appealing. And as someone, I have a doctorate in public health, and so I have a tremendous interest in protecting human health and the environment. And I began my research career at Los Alamos on an interdisciplinary team as a graduate student, and that's what was appealing, was to see how people come together. Over the years, my leadership experience has grown from, I moved in and out of the Environmental Safety and Health Organization in various leadership roles 4 different times in my career at Los Alamos. I joined Berkeley from the laboratory as the Associate Director for Environmental Safety and Health, and I had a fairly sizable organization, an organization of about 750 people and more than a $150 million budget. You have to understand that Los Alamos is a 40 square mile, 12,000 person.
Berkeley's a big lab in terms of people, but Los Alamos is bigger, and in terms of area, much bigger.
And fairly complex. But throughout my career, I chose different leadership challenges. I managed business and operations organizations, waste management, facilities, engineering, maintenance, and I also served at senior levels within the laboratory, much like in the office that I now lead. So I'm delighted to be here, and one of the important roles that I had in my previous life at Los Alamos was community outreach. You can imagine, as a person responsible for more than 30 federal and state environmental regulatory permits, I interacted with the local pueblos, the national park, the national forest, state government, local government agencies, federal government, elected officials, and my commitment was clear that the sole reason why my organization existed was to enable the success of the laboratory's mission while protecting our workers, protecting the public, and human health and the environment. And so I bring that experience with me here, and I'm looking forward to working with this body to understand where I can make meaningful contributions to help the local community in a number of areas, everywhere from opportunities for small businesses, as well as I need to listen, understand, and learn from all of you where I can make a difference, because that's my commitment to all of you. So with that, any questions for me?
Great. CAG
Okay.
members?
We could give you a tour of Berkeley
Okay.
as a start.
Well,
The
yeah.
town, because it's quite a different environment from Los Alamos, which is out in the sticks.
Well, yes, we were, I would classify it as the sticks, because our county consisted of 2 communities with a total population of about 18,000 people. And I was about a nominal 110 miles from the airport, and so it's a beautiful area, and if you, I don't want to be a booster for northern New Mexico, but if you're looking for areas with antiquities and cliff dwellings and a beautiful natural environment, I would recommend a trip to Santa Fe and go visit Santa Fe Taos and Los Alamos. So, okay.
It's beautiful.
Yes.
Any other comments, questions? So can we follow up on that Berkeley tour? That would be a great idea, I think.
Seriously, it's a hugely different environment with very different community opinions. And on just kind of a short deal maybe from us sometime would be helpful.
It would be. I'd be open. Yes, I would be open to that. What I'd like to know is, where is it safe to cycle? So.
Well, I should say, his initial discussion was how to drive into town where people are walking out, looking at their screen right in front of you at every corner without paying any attention, because that's not much of a problem in Los Alamos.
We have our own, my previous community, we had our own challenges. So I'd be delighted to learn more about Berkeley. That's part of the reason why I'm here.
Mhm.
So thank you.
Well, Kirsten could tell you a lot.
Yeah.
We're gonna get coffee.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you.
And the city government and how it all works and doesn't work.
Okay, fantastic. Danny?
And I guess maybe another related thing to tap onto that is that Los Alamos didn't necessarily have a university right next to it, right?
Well,
so,
we actually had a branch campus of
Oh, sorry,
University of
okay.
New Mexico.
okay. Well, yeah.
Yeah, well, one of the things, actually, Mark Fisher, who's the vice chancellor for his equivalent at the campus, is, I point out, was somebody for him to get in touch with right away because, and Mark Fisher is someone who had that role at Santa Barbara, and I knew there, and is sort of a gateway to a lot of the people who do the same things and that we work with closely, of course.
We're scheduled to meet, so I'm looking forward. So that's just an example of, there are many constituencies that I need to, people that I need to meet and understand their roles relative to my role. So I'm open to learning more and listening to your ideas on priorities and areas of concern in particular. Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's bring Stan up then for the capital projects update. And just a quick reminder, we do use the mic so we get a much better audio recording for all the meetings that we have
We don't
here.
need it for the people in this room, but we need it for the,
Yeah, it picks
for
up.
the archive.
Exactly. So,
And I will say that we just made this presentation for the bioepic building we talked about. And so Stan was one of our heroes there. He presented that to review and did a great job, and that's partly why we got approval. So, Stan.
Great. Thank you very much. And one comment from Michael on the bike riding is, with two young drivers in my house, you can check in with them where they're going to be out and about, and then you'll know where you'll be safe to go bike riding.
I think I'm going to resume mountain bike Friday.
So we've been gaining a lot of momentum in our cleanup, and one of the things that Mike mentioned is that there's a potential for additional budget for us in this year for cleanup. I want to jump right into where we're at with Old Town, and just remind folks, the Old Town is cleaning up an older neighborhood at the laboratory, buildings that date back to the 40s. We've had earlier phases 1 and 1B, 1A and 1B that are closed out. And phase 3 was the project that we worked earlier this year, which was mainly cleaning up soil, remnant soil in the areas of 1B. So mainly that's been in the 52, building 16 footprints. So phase 4, which I have bolded here, that was stepping out into cleaning up the retaining wall, which separated building 5 from the 16 pad and from 52. And with all these numbers that I'm discussing, the main goal of what we're trying to do is to clean up legacy contamination and also to create brownfield sites for future repurposement. So it's really a twofold approach. So we're in the middle of phase 4, and I've got more detail on that later. Phase 2 is what stands to gain the most momentum with the additional funds. This is cleaning up the balance of building 4 and 14 in building 7. And if we're to receive those additional funds, we'd be able to roll right into some characterization of 4 and 14 and some demolition maybe later in the summer and the fall for those buildings. So with phase 3, we're in punch list, which is kind of an interesting process for demolition. We're just making sure we have all of the contamination for the phase 3 project has been cleaned up and properly shipped. Now what we're doing is we're just making sure that the final areas are backfilled, and we're finalizing our documentation for EPA. So we go through a rigorous process where we review the final sample results internally. They're reviewed also by BSO, the Berkeley site office at DOE, and then they're presented to EPA for final approval. So we're working through that process for phase 3. Phase 4 is really our active demolition right now. And if you take a peek, there's a wall that runs right along here. which is about a 12-foot wall. And this is the building 5 pad, and this is building 16. So the scope of the project has been to remove some slab, which is referred to as the Perkins pad, the utilities underneath the slab, to haul that waste, and then to get into the demolition of this wall. So I brought some pictures along to show you the process that we're going through. This is our excavator, and this is a processing implement that is on the end of the excavator. And we're using this to tear up the slab. Here is building 5. If you guys recall, a year and a half ago, this is where we had a building that we demolished, and this is building 16, and this building has since been demolished. So this is the pad, and here is the wall below that we're working on. I want to show you a little bit of the process that we go through. So here we can see we use smaller excavators to dig around the utilities, and in this case, we're using hand tools to identify the utilities. It's really important for us to find the utilities by hand, because we can isolate them and wrap them up. And there may be unknown things inside the utilities, and it's just the easiest way to keep it clean. So here you can see an abandoned old electrical duct bank. And we very carefully made sure that the wires were all empty and that it's inside of it's just a pipe. And then you can see the process is that we clean everything out very carefully. So this is what's left behind. We've left the wall in place because we knew we were going to have some weather in the next couple weeks, and that really allows us to cover it up really easily. So moving forward in the next 2 months until we see you again, we'll be completely demolishing the building 16 wall. We'll be working on the 52A wall. We'll be getting all that packaged and shipped. And then on phase 2, we're really going to start resuming these planning efforts as soon as we get a full sense of the budget for the balance of this year. And we'll be moving into characterization and moving forward with the balance of Old Town. So IGB has been another area of excitement for us. It is just coming out of the ground. It's very amazing to see the construction process. So we currently plan to complete the building in March of 2019. And then the move-in, bringing people from Walnut Creek, will take about 6 months. We're preparing to work on the 3rd floor slab. So we have 2 full stories which are completed. And we had a concrete pour today which poured the last of the concrete walls that goes up to the 2nd floor. So that was a real milestone for the team. We're having a real tough time getting concrete, and you'd think it would be a readily available material, but there's a small project across the bay where they're building a new basketball stadium that is just drawing all of the region's resources. So it's tough to compete with some of our smaller pours. So we're pouring the concrete today, and then the modular utility plant, which is the centralized area that will be providing utilities for the development in that area. That building is in place, the roof is getting completed, the siding is nearly done, and now we're starting to install some of the piping and some of the equipment on the inside of that utility plant. So a couple of photos. So here's 2 stories. So once we had nothing, so here's grade, and here's the first 2 lifts. And if you recall, the majority of the laboratory facilities are in the lower 2 stories for vibration isolation, but also to create an integration of science in the facility. So folks will come in, have a chance to see the research that's ongoing through large glass windows, and then they'll move into the upper 2 floors to their offices and labs. Actually, in this building, it's just offices in the upper 2 floors. So here's a view from a different angle, and you can see we have the site retaining wall here at the 1st story level. I guess you call it the 2nd story. And I got a different view, and this shows downtown Berkeley is beyond, showing the 2 stories come together. So the bottom 2 stories are all concrete. So we're forming concrete walls, we're forming the slabs and shoring them. And then the upper 2 stories, if you recall, are steel. So we'll be transitioning rather quickly to steel erection, and then the final roof joists are long span steel joists. So that will go very quickly. And this is the inside of the MUP. So you can see it's starting to take shape with the large chilled water piping in place. Oh, it's the modular utility plant, yes. And we are centralizing the chillers and cooling towers because they get a lot of efficiency if they share a load across multiple buildings. And we've installed the portion really that's required to supply the IGB, but in the future, should we have more need, why we can simply add more capacity to this building. And here's the outside with the siding in place and the IGB beyond. So coming up, more shear walls at the IGB, and we'll be working on steel in May. So that'll be an exciting time. And then on the MUP, we'll start receiving chillers and cooling towers on the MUP and placing those and starting to get those started up. So that's capital projects.
Okay, any questions or comments? Again, please raise the microphone. Okay, yes?
I confess I get lost in building 16 and wall B3 or whatever. Where are we in the overall plan for demolition of Old Town? I mean, when we started out, and it's funding dependent, but it's been going on for a long time. Is this on schedule? Is it slower? Do we need more funding? Do we need more what? Or are you happy about it?
Yes.
Or
So the bigger question probably is Mike happy about it? But no, we're pleased with the progress that we've made at Old Town. For folks that have been involved in demolition and remediation, they're not projects that unfold at a very quick pace. There's a strong regulatory framework. There's a lot of testing and sampling that we go through. There's a very careful way that we work in the field. So I would say that we're quite pleased. The crews that we have in the field are very, 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 very good. And I would say that that's been a growing process for us. So I'd say in general, with the scope of work that was conceived for the phase that we're in, I'd say we're shade more than halfway there. We have real work ahead of us, but we're very pleased with the budget forecasts that are coming in. Anywhere from $20 to $30 million on a site that's that small is about what we can cost in a year. We've got limitations on vibration and of course the truck traffic that we're careful of here bringing through the city of Berkeley. So that's a little bit of a constraining function on us. But overall, I would say we're pleased.
and you feel like you're on time, as it were?
Yeah, so we work toward large mission milestones, and one of the drivers for us will be, Mike mentioned, the ALSU project, and as plans are coming together for that, we will ensure that we target having nice, usable laydown space for the large subcontractors that will be doing that work. So in that sense, we're on schedule.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, thank you, Stan. Moving right along, we will go on to the presentation on emergency management. So we have Tonya Petty to handle that one. And we have a clicker.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I am the lab's emergency manager for 4 years now. I'm a certified emergency manager through the International Association of Emergency Managers and a master continuity professional. Similar to my colleagues here, I come from other sites. You can probably tell by my accent. Exactly. I worked at the Pantex plant for 20 years, and then I was at Argonne, Chicago for a couple of years doing emergency management there. And I just want to point out that it's really great to have these community meetings, and I just have to point out 3 of the people in here are emergency directors or emergency public information officers on the emergency management team at the lab. So we take the safety very serious here. Having dealt with some different hazards at Pantex and whatnot, The great science we do, it just doesn't stop there, because really having 5 people, and even Dr. Brandt, his second day, gave me 3 hours of his time to train him up for the emergency director role. So very important. And I'm sorry that Amina Sefa with UC Berkeley was already busy tonight. And then we also do a lot of planning with City of Berkeley. Assistant Chief Keith May, and Sarah Lana, Jennifer Lazo, we meet with all those people monthly. They weren't able to join, but I'm going to show where our programs integrate when I talk about the labs program. So for emergency management, it's a president-driven directive, national framework that we use. There's executive orders that guide us. A lot of, like I said, presidential policies, Homeland Security directives. Homeland Security actually has authority for emergency management, and then they institute that through the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Because it is such a national framework, even though my partners aren't here with me tonight, we really have to implement the same types of programs, because the laws don't stop, whether it's city, county, the lab, which is a special district that we'll talk about a little bit more. So for those of you who don't know how the lab sits, we're partially in the city of Oakland, partially in the city of Berkeley. The campus is right below us, and you can see right the blue area there where the lab is. We do a lot of planning with our city partners, but a whole lot with Alameda County, because we're known as a special district. Through the executive orders, the governor has authority for emergency management, and they pass that down to the chief elected official of the cities and counties. When you have a special district like the lab doing some unique work and some hazards and have some federal agencies and whatnot, they let you declare your own protective actions, if you will. So if the city of Berkeley decided to evacuate, the chief elected official has the responsibility to do that. At our laboratory, it's a similar concept. We have Stan Tucholsky, who's an emergency director, Ellen Ford, Dr. Brandt, and they all implement those protective actions for the laboratory. Does that make sense? Okay. We are a fairly small site, 202 acres, about 200 buildings, 82 of which are occupied. Anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 people on our campus any given time. We meet regularly with the city and the county. We have monthly meetings with both, and it's not the same meeting, so we see each other at least 2 times a month, sometimes 3. So it's a very tiered response. The way that it works, coming from Texas, I'm really surprised that all these good things come out of California, like the National Incident Management System. 1971, we have tornadoes there. You would think they would do some of this there, but it's been the wildland fires and the earthquakes that's really advanced emergency management. You know, a little bit the Hurricane Katrina, but there's been really good works for emergency management come out of California. So we have a state emergency management system here as well, in addition to all the national frameworks that we use. And basically what that says is emergency will start at the local level and it will always end at the local level. But it gives you the authority to go upscale if you need to. So if we had an incident at the lab and we activate our emergency operations center, the city of Berkeley activates their emergency operations center, the campus as well, then we all feed into Alameda County, and that's kind of then over us, and then it goes up to the region, and then it goes up to the state. We have a direct line to federal assets just because of the nature of the work we do being a federal agency. But the whole point is that we handle it on our own, and when we can't, we call in these additional resources, but then whenever they finish, you know, mitigating, then they give it back to us to finish out the emergency and get back to recovery and normal operations. So every emergency management program uses a very phased approach. There's 5 phases. We always start out with planning, which is a lot of what we do. Probably 80% of our time in emergency management is spent on planning. We identify the hazards we have. For the laboratory, we have several. We have a great wildland fire threat. We're on the Hayward Fault, among some other things. So we do a lot of planning around that and analyzing of those hazards. We also work with the county, the city, and the campus to identify other ones. Talking about students and cell phones and complacency, all of those things come into the planning phase. Preparedness is what you do to help not only the people that have a duty to respond, but the public. So it's for anybody that's here tonight that wants to know, what's my community doing if we were to face wildland fires like the North Bay fires? That's a big, big part of what we do is the preparedness phase. Mitigation is really big at the lab. Probably our most esteemed video on our Facebook is our Goats Gone Wild. We bring out goats to do some mitigation on our wildland fire hazard with the vegetation. Just the way we build our buildings, there's significant mitigation factors in that. A lot of legal frameworks, as Stan mentioned. We have different seismic retrofitting on those. All of these things are mitigation efforts. If we have an emergency, then of course we get into the response phase. This is strictly limited to life safety actions. So if there's going to be any kind of life safety consequences, you consider this phase the response phase. And then recovery, of course, is getting back to our mission or serving our community. We do have some offsites that are in Berkeley. They mentioned Walnut Creek, JGI, Joint Genome Institute. Sorry, we have our acronyms. But Walnut Creek has a center there. We have a couple in Emeryville and Berkeley. We have Potter, where we do some research. We have the OCFO, Office of the Chief Financial Officer. So all of these offsite agencies, or all these offsite facilities, even though they're a part of the laboratory, they go under the jurisdiction of the community in which they operate. So we do a lot of things to analyze the hazards, but it's brought up with the city then that they are working in, similar to any other industry that's doing some hazardous operations or research operations. So that's kind of a big overview of the laboratory. Does anybody have questions about the lab overview? So we talked about hazards. We have our zombies here because there are a large population that likes to walk around with earbuds in and sunglasses on and cell phones. And we really can't ignore that as a threat because it's just becoming more and more the norm. Not only are you subject to an accident that way, but you don't see what's going on around you as much either. And we all know the world we live in today. It's really important to be aware of your surroundings. We talked about the lab being on the Hayward Fault. Our roads are very narrow and winding. Anybody that's been up there knows, that there's some pretty steep hillsides up there. Our fire engine, for example, specially made to make the turns for our roads. We have some utility hazards. El Sobrante's up there, and we have some gas lines and other things. And we do a lot to protect those as well, shut-off valves if they shake too violently from earthquakes. Our infrastructure, although we're building all the time and decommissioning, we are the oldest science lab, 1931, and so we do have some old infrastructure out there. So these are all just hazards that we pay attention to, that we plan with the community, but the main ones that we all really focus on are told through the National Response Framework. Natural phenomena, earthquakes, landslides, debris flows are a big one for us. The wildland fire is much greater than what we ever thought. We realized that through the fire season in 2017. Human-caused disasters, anything that an individual does, terrorist attack, active threat, cyber event, and then technological accidental are those events that might result in a hazardous material release or that could result in a fire or an explosion. Were any of you involved in the shelter in place that happened in Richmond about a month and a half ago? They had a fire and they ordered a shelter in place. So smoke is very toxic, and the town ordered a shelter in place. And we reviewed what they were doing to see if it would impact the lab with the plume. So just an example of how we share information. The bear industry, just right up the street from our Potter campus, about 6 months ago, had a little small release, and we sheltered in place at our Potter facility. So we're always working together to share information like that. We do continuity through our emergency management program, similar to what the campus does. The city, not as much so, but we try to protect the mission of what the university is doing and what the lab is doing through our emergency management program. Typically comes into the recovery phase where we start prioritizing bringing operations back. A big difference in a facility level event and a site level event. We have facility level events quite often. And we have great response out there. Berkeley Fire came up on Friday. We had a fire. The big ones are the site level. So I know a lot of you probably were around August the 2nd when we had a wildland fire up in the Tilden Park region. We evacuated our site. The campus did not evacuate. They did evacuate 3 buildings up in the hills, Lawrence Hall Science, Space Sciences, and MSRI. Somebody took a picture of that tweet and sent it on their Twitter and said, hey, UC Berkeley is evacuating, and so they only copied a portion of it. So then the campus self-evacuated, which we found out, does cause some problems when you're trying to evacuate up above it down into the very rural area. So some lessons learned from that event, but obviously facility levels are much easier to orchestrate than the site level. We learned some lessons during that time. There were 2 events going on that day, a fire and a security event. So our resources were a little bit strapped from the security perspective to do traffic control. But one key thing to point out, when we have our facility level events, we have enough responders to take care of the event. Whenever we go to a disaster scenario, like a wildland fire or an earthquake, then we are going to have more victims than we do responders. And so I think one of the greatest things that we can do at the laboratory is really prepare our staff to not be a strain on a strained system. Are there any community emergency response team members in here for the city of Berkeley? CERT members? No? Diz, you know all about it. So I'm a CERT member for Concord, but it's basically just that philosophy. It's planning with your community, not for them. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the lab does that. First and foremost, we train our laboratory employees on protective actions. And they have guides, so these are hanging all around the laboratory. They're in the lab spaces. And they tell everybody not only what to do in an emergency, but how to report an emergency. We have it on your cell phone, so if you don't have a guide handy, you can use the app on your cell phone. And this is really important. We have over 20,000 users/guest visitors every year. And so for them to be able to know what to do in an emergency is going to help the greater good, which is what we're all about. We have the same protective actions for the lab as the city does. We have an evacuate, shelter in place, and lockdown that we train our lab population on. Not only do we train them, we drill them. We drill annually at least on evacuation, and we're rolling in some more shelter in place and lockdown drills as well. We've come up with some new criteria for locations to shelter. What we learned in the North Bay fires and the August 2nd event was that there's the possibility we may not have time to evacuate our lab. We just may not have enough gates to open and roadways to open to get everyone safely off site. So everywhere that you see a blue building on here, it's been tested for smoke rating and fire rating, and that is where we would shelter our population and feel that they would be safe through the first pass of a wildland fire. So that's kind of how we're training so that we don't clog the roadways down into the city. It doesn't do anyone any good if we have bottlenecks around like we did on our August 2nd event. Everywhere you see the green boxes, that's where they have assembly areas that are outdoors. So that's where they would go for the earthquake until there were shelters opening up down in Berkeley, and then we would send them there. So we have a strong emergency response organization. I already talked about all the people that are here today. This mirrors what the county does and what the campus does, with the exception of this normal operations here. The National Incident Management System that I talked about that was actually brought out of the California wildfires in 1970 tell us exactly how we're going to set this up, what positions we're going to have. We tweak it just a little bit for the laboratory because of the functions we do, but it's the same for the county and the city. We have a 24/7, 365 operations center. I presented to this group in 2016, and we didn't have this before, so this is something new. We're always monitoring activities. We're always listening to the 911 calls that go down to UCPD, University of California Police Department. They also provide our gate control and they help us make notifications when something has happened. So this is something we've stood up in the last 2 years that really helps us have a better situational awareness. We still have Alameda County Fire on the Hill that provides our firefighting. They also provide hazmat, medical, and technical rescue, patient extrication. We have a contract with the University of California Police Department who provides any of our armed law enforcement. If we were needing bomb squad technicians or the bomb squad truck. We've activated with all the different protests that the university has and shared information through our emergency operations centers just to make sure that we were both having situational awareness. They also provide criminal investigations and traffic enforcement for the lab. So that's a really good way for us to stay in sync with our partners too, is using those contractors who are in the county and with the campus. This just is what the emergency response organization looks like if you were to put it in an org chart. I mentioned the National Incident Management System, operations, planning, logistics, finance, and then of course your command. These are all the same for the city and the county as far as the positions. They get a little bit more detailed with public works and those kind of things. We have the same objectives. We're going to try to stabilize the incident, but always first and foremost, it's protection of the people. We try to prevent any damage to the environment or our lab assets. We always want to try to get in recovery and reconstitution. We actually have to do that before we can terminate the emergency. And we're in emergency mode until there is no more threat of life safety. Another big thing the laboratory's done, again, to not be a strain on the steering system, we have community emergency response teams. You can do this in your county or we teach it up at the lab. We have 81 CERT members now, and these people do light search and rescue, basic fire suppression, patient assessment, patient transport. They would actually be able to run a shelter operation if we were stuck on the hill for 72 hours, which is kind of what FEMA predicts. The building emergency teams, this is an OSHA requirement. Have an emergency plan for a building that has over 50 occupants. They help us implement those protective actions of evacuate, shelter in place, and lockdown. We also have 5 teams of 5 damage assessment teams. So the campus has about 200. And what this is called is a safety assessment program where they would go up and look at the buildings after they've experienced either an earthquake or a wildland fire to see if it's safe to go back in them. The last team we have, medical emergency response team, these are EMT basics or emergency medical technicians, same as you would get if you called 911. We've had 4 people step up and volunteer at the laboratory. Even though we have the 4 firefighters that are paramedics/EMTs, we have a good population of volunteers that have been trained and qualified as an EMT as well, just to try to help not be a strain on a strained system again. Because we know all the resources in this regional catastrophic event are going to be really slim. So our emergency communications, this is the county's emergency operations center. This is, of course, our incident commander, which is Alameda County or University of California Police Department. We have our emergency operations center, which is on the hill. And we can come down to the cities and use the cities if necessary. And then, of course, we communicate with the lab and the public that is on the hill. So just to point out, if we experience an emergency, one of my requirements is that I have 15 minutes to notify local, county, state, and DOE headquarters. So that includes the campus, that includes the city of Oakland and Berkeley, and Alameda County. Within 15 minutes, we're going to let them know that we've experienced a bad event. There's other notifications that go on, like our emergency director is going to notify our lab director in the University of California. And then we have mission support, which gets into sustaining our mission, and those notifications are made by a mission support officer. We have a big public information. John German also went through training 3 hours last week so that he can do public information if we experience an emergency at the lab. We go 3 deep on all of our positions to make sure that we always have coverage. We communicate a lot in the same ways that the city and the campus do. We have a status page. If you guys haven't checked out City of Berkeley or Alameda counties, there's a lot of good information out there that you can go and check out and sign up for alerts. We have a status line that even the public can call to find out if the lab is in an operational status or not. We have a Facebook, we have a Twitter. UCPD primarily communicates through their Twitter feed, so if they're ever experiencing an emergency or a protest, that's what we follow and share what's happening through our Twitter. They also use NIXL alerts and AC alerts. These are the things I'd recommend as community members that you sign up for. Dizzy, you probably get these. It's very useful. They tell you when roads are closed or there's criminal activity going on. And if there was ever a mass evacuation, then they would use these systems to let the community know. I'm signed up for them, they're signed up for mine, and like I say, we meet regularly and talk about these things. The last thing I want to talk about is some of the different supplies and equipment we've done. I call it the yo-yo philosophy, and it really stands for you're on your own. So we are trying to be as self-sufficient as possible on this hillside. We have 6 8x20 cargo containers. You can see a picture right here. There's one in every zone. They have 188 cases of MREs, 106 cases of water, medical supplies, tents, tarps, potties, tables, administrative supplies, communication devices. They have ventilation to them, they have power, and they're all over the laboratory. So if our buildings aren't accessible, then we can go to these containers and start doing some shelter operations. I mentioned the emergency assembly areas. These are just exterior rally points if we have to evacuate our building. We have rescue boxes. So I talked about our community emergency response team, or CERT team. They can do some basic search and rescue. And so we keep cribbing and shoring equipment in our rescue boxes so that they can go and pry up walls or cut down fences or move trees or whatever kind of things they can do. They have picks, axes, shovels, crowbars, all kinds of equipment in these rescue boxes. And we talked about the shelter areas, which are the blue boxes down there. Those buildings are still construction. They can turn off the ventilation if the smoke is too heavy, and we experienced a lot of that during the North Bay fire scenario, so that's one of the reasons we did this study. So these are just a couple of the areas that we keep emergency supplies or we would go to in an emergency. Response facilities, I talked about the Emergency Operations Center. We have been offered to use the cities when we had the August the 2nd event. We drill with them, we exercise with them. They come watch ours in our EOC and we go watch theirs. We are standing up an alternate Emergency Operations Center capability where we can go anywhere if we need to go to our facility in Walnut Creek because the earthquakes impacted the Bay Area. Or if we have the wildland fire in that direction and we come down to the city of Berkeley. So that's something we're just standing up. We have a joint information center that we can have press conferences or news releases if we need to. And then I mentioned the operations center already, which really keeps good intel on what's going on at the lab. They also monitor the radios for the University of California and Alameda County. So if there's an event going on, especially if it were regional, like the August 2nd event, we had 14 different responders on that fire. Then we hear all that traffic, and it really gives us good situational awareness. All right, so this is all the disaster supplies we have at the lab. The black boxes are rescue boxes. You can't really see the blue stars too well, but that's where our containers are. And so we've tried to implement the zone for our protective actions. Like during the August 2nd, we evacuated our zone 6 first because it was in the most harm's way. And some others, we would probably shelter in place or evacuate at a later time. So this is all the training that we've done with the laboratory. We have over 700 volunteers, which is a great number that would help us respond. Again, our goal for the city and the campus is to not be a strain on the strain system already. Any questions?
Okay, great. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Tonya. Okay, comments, follow-up, questions? Okay, Rich, we can always count on you for insight.
So the impression I had from, Glenn Kubiak presented to us on the sort of the August 2nd event and then the follow-up drill that was done in December. And so my interpretation of it, not his words, are, it seemed to me the two things that strike me as being sort of important, and I just wonder sort of how you've dealt with it, is one is the communicating with the lab staff, right? Letting them know what's going on, because not everybody is sitting in front of their computer. Right. Not everybody is looking at their Facebook page or whatever, right? So that's one. And the other one was that, and I think the August 2nd one was the real driver for this, was that I'm looking for the right word here. The lack or it could be better coordination with UC Berkeley, partly because of the fact that you wind up having the streets jammed up with people, everybody trying to get out of the same place at once, right?
Right. So for our laboratory population, we have other communication mechanisms. We use a system called Lab Alert. People sign up for that, similar to the Nixle or AC Alert, and they get text messages. We also use two-way radios, especially for our responders. And then we have public address systems in about 90% of our buildings. So those are the ways we primarily communicate with our lab population. We do not have an outdoor warning siren, like some of the sites I've worked at, which some say is good, some say is bad. It could have helped out August 2nd because we could not communicate with the people in their cars very well. But as far as what happened on August 2nd, I don't think there was any way for the campus or the lab to know that the students were going to choose to self-evacuate. That really draws importance to following the guidelines that the emergency responders are giving. If you take it upon yourself to do, what you think is best, then it could cause, problems with the overall plan. And like I say, it was unfortunate they kind of took a copy of the recommended evacuation of the upper buildings and copied it and said, oh, UC's evacuating. And a lot of people just took that and decided, that it was for real for the whole campus. But definitely, there's always ways to improve, always ways to do it better. During the North Bay fires, they didn't set off the emergency alert system for that reason. They didn't want to clog the roadways, so there was no alert that went out at all. So it's kind of, we know it's going to be a bad situation. We know it's going to be chaotic. But there's always ways to improve, and we are working corrective actions right now with the city and the campus on that.
Okay, thank you. Danny?
Yeah. Just as a point of feedback, I'm in this weird bucket where I'm technically a lab employee, but I spend 0% of my time at the lab, but I occasionally have meetings up there. And I know nothing about sort of the alert systems that get sent out if I was in a meeting up the hill. So,
okay.
Not your fault, but it's maybe something should be done or thought about.
Yeah, we are working on our visitor population right now. What we would hope is our building emergency team, which I pointed out, they wear orange vests. They are responsible for implementing protective actions in their building. So hopefully you would have a host and a building emergency team member to help you. But we're currently trying to get an emergency alert system ourselves that takes over a geographical region so that we can push out messages similar to Amber Alerts so that you don't have to go and sign up. You don't have to have a lab password, and you would get the messages so that you would know what to do. Hopefully when you came into the site, if you had your badge or your parking permit, you got a little flyer on emergency management. Okay, so at least you would kind of know the protective actions, but that's definitely areas we can improve on. I appreciate that.
If something bad is happening, it wouldn't be like to pull out my badge and be like, oh.
Right, yeah, of course. All
Okay.
right, thank you.
Anything else? Okay,
Thank you.
Let's find out about dark fiber. All right.
It's so mysterious. Even though it's something relatively, it's not that exciting. But I'll tell you. Maybe I'm not setting this up properly. Okay, so I'm Jonathan Aho Franklin. I'm a staff scientist up at the lab. I'm a geophysicist in the Earth and Environmental Science area. I'm also a Berkeley resident, 10 years, and actually my kids are in BUSD, and I live about 6 blocks away. So it's neat from both a science side and a community side to be able to join you this evening. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about our recent research on dark fiber for soil and water characterization in earthquakes. So just to give you a feeling for what dark fiber is telecommunications fiber, which has been installed underground but isn't currently used for communications. And it turns out there's a lot of that. And so a lot of what we've been doing over the last couple of years are developing techniques to make seismic measurements on fiber optic cables. And so the kind of interesting marriage in this project is using these unused telecommunications fibers to make seismic measurements, and therefore what you can infer from those seismic measurements you can use any place where you have dark fiber installed, with certain caveats. In any case, so I'm also going to talk about this kind of ongoing experiment we have running out in the Sacramento Basin, which we call FOSSA, the Fiber Optic Seismic Superarray, with a nice little Madagascar carnivore as the logo. So, but first I'd like to actually say this is a work of a lot of other people. Since it's a science talk, a lot of good graduate students and postdocs have worked with me. Nate Lindsay at Cal and Chen Do, who's now at a startup company, did a lot of the data processing, which you'll show. We also have collaborators in ESNet, which is our user facility which handles scientific communications of the actual bits and bytes kind and not the strategic kind, and Computational Research Division, and folks from other institutions who've worked with us on the project from Stanford and the Cold Regions Research Lab. So in any case, so this is kind of a story in a lot of parts because I have to explain all the technologies which go into it. The first motivation part will be kind of obvious, which is the needs and sensing networks in California. The second is about this technology, distributed acoustic sensing, which allows you to make seismic measurements on fiber. I'll talk a bit about the sensing resource itself, which is dark fiber and ESNet, the experiment, and some really preliminary results. This project's been running about a year and a half. In any case, so this barely needs to be even shown, but two of the kind of long-term challenges for California are dealing with water resources, their management, and understanding how they'll change in a warming climate. And the other is characterizing and understanding mitigating natural seismicity. And so progress on both of these fronts, both characterizing groundwater resources and in understanding seismicity, are enabled by new sensing techniques, things which will allow us to increase our dense networks, which cover both seismic activity and information which is useful for groundwater resource monitoring. So in general, the big problem with measurements are that a lot of the important networks we have are relatively sparse. So despite a lot of effort over many years, California's seismic network still has significant gaps. This is the combined CISN network. So these are all the seismographs which are used for recording in California, which actually have archived data. And you can see it's pretty dense, especially in coastal regions over here, but there's still big gaps. There's poor coverage in the basins, which generally aren't considered seismically active, but may have some smaller seismicity in sparsely populated regions like the Modak Plateau, and then almost nothing offshore because it's very difficult to put instrumentation offshore. And the result is that there are many regions which actually have a pretty high minimum detectable event threshold, and in the sense that you can't even see earthquakes which are below magnitude 2 in a lot of parts of the state. And this is in particular in the Sacramento Basin. So there are implications for this. The first is that it's difficult to detect small events related to induced seismicity. It's also difficult to detect small events which might be important because of fault structure or some other process. And and California is likely the best instrumented state in the US. Alaska has a lot of seismicity too, but much sparser instrumentation. So we're also interested in solutions for these kinds of problems.
How about Hawaii?
Hawaii? That's actually a good question. They have a pretty... It's a much smaller area, so I've never actually looked at that calculation, how many permanent seismographs are there per square kilometer. I'm sure that would be a fun thing to find out. And the other side of this, too, since we're interested in hydrologic monitoring, is how sparse our information on groundwater, for example, in terms of water table depth is across many of our major basins. So this is just a map of all of the wells which are used as part of the CASGEM network, which is the state network which digitizes all of the different groundwater table, water table measurements in most of the important sections of the state. And so even in sections like this is Sacramento Basin, this is Sacramento over here, there are large gaps and sort of zones where we have very few wells which are sampling what water's doing in the subsurface sense. In this case, it's 12 wells over a 95 by 10 mile region which are actually sampled and recorded on a regular basis. So, in both of these cases, we have sparse networks which are really monitoring important processes which are of relevance to the state. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the technology, and then you'll see how all this folds together. So the technology we've been working on for the last couple of years is distributed. It's a brand of distributed fiber optic sensing called distributed acoustic sensing. All of these measurements have in common the idea that you're using a laser, you're sending very brief pulses of light, and you're looking at different types of intrinsic scattering on the fiber as a function of length. And if you do this fast enough and you can effectively record the changes in scattering in the fiber as a function of time, you can make measurements of acoustic amplitude or extensional strain. You can make measurements of temperature and also of quasi-static strain, depending on which scattering modality you're looking at. So the scattering itself comes from tiny imperfections in each of the fiber, and so you're basically looking at the way that scattering changes as you stretch a fiber in some minute amount. So really over in the last 4 or 5 years has this particular technique called distributed acoustic sensing become something which generates useful seismic data. We tend not to work more on the photonic side, but we're actually an early user of this technique in a broad range of applications. So distributed acoustic sensing, it's this rapidly advancing approach for measuring seismic wave field using commercial fibers. And when we started out, we got into this because we were interested in instrumenting deep oil and gas and CO2 sequestration wells. And in those kinds of environments, it's actually very expensive and difficult to put traditional seismic sensors, but fiber is cheap, and you actually can cement it behind casing in wells and do a lot of interesting things. But then at a certain point, we realized, well, this is the same fiber which is in the telecom network. Why don't we try this out as an alternative way of making measurements? So we started in this geologic CO2 sequestration program, but then it became obvious there were a lot of other applications as well. And the really big strength of it is that you're making a measurement of this tiny stretch in the fiber every meter to 10 meters along the entire length of the fiber. So instead of having 10 geophones, which you lay out, you have thousands and thousands of locations which are measuring this stretch. So it ends up being a very low cost per sensor, and it's dollars per foot for these types of cables. And it's also very rugged. It actually can handle a lot of extreme conditions. And so this is an example of an early active seismic measurements we made with this technology back in 2012. But each year, the photonics, the folks who are working on these boxes, becomes better and better. At this point, it's still a little bit worse than traditional geophones, but it's catching up quickly. And the advantage is you can make measurements in thousands of places instead of 1 or 2. So it's getting comparable to seismographs. This is from a recent paper which we put out comparing it to kind of classical broadband measurements, which are what's used in earthquake seismology. And at this point, it's still quite a bit noisier, but we're getting to the point where you can almost match it up, wiggle for wiggle, at least for larger events. And this is an example of a M3.8, which we recorded up in Fairbanks on a fit-for-purpose array, not one which was from telecom. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the resource. So I've told you about distributed acoustic sensing. Hopefully you're interested. So what is dark fiber? And this is what it all started out with. So dark fiber is this fiber installed for telecommunications purposes, but not currently used. And when someone's transmitting data on something and has that right hardware, they call that fiber lit. And so if it lacks the required hardware and isn't used, then it's dark. So the big question is, can we use it for interesting sensing applications? So during the first .com boom, this is kind of interesting, there was a big flood of cheap capital, which led to a huge oversupply of installed fiber.
With too much money.
Yeah, and so, but then what ended up happening afterwards is there were subsequent improvements in the number of bits and bytes you could shove over a given fiber. So they ended up with a lot of fibers which were in the ground from bankrupt companies, which were no longer used to transmit data.
Had no value anymore.
Had no value anymore, yeah. So, and it turns out that only 10% of the actual fiber cost is the install. The rest is like getting the permits to cut open the pavement and getting the conduit installed and just the 1,000, kind of components of, a big capital asset project. So, all of these fibers there, they can now be leased or bought from providers. And if they're not used, they're really this stranded asset of decreasing value as a function of time. So now they're like really low cost to actually rent these. You can do like less than $200 a linear mile across a lot of sections of the United States. So the question is, can this be used as a sensor and pick out anything reasonable? Oh, this is just I just had fun, looking at Google Ngram. So there's this peak in talking about dark fiber right at the first .com bust here, and then people stopped talking about it as a function of time. This is from books, and this is from web traffic. So one of the neat things about dark fiber, though, too, is that it's almost everywhere, but it's really poorly mapped. So I was looking for a reliable estimate of how many linear kilometers of fiber are installed but not used in the world, and nobody had this number. I just couldn't find it. So this is an example of one particular network provider, Zayo's dark fiber network in the Bay Area. So it has a lot of coverage. It's a little bit in weird places, but and this is in the entire United States, at least from a couple of different providers which they were able to get map information from. You even have fiber in oceanic environments too, so you can go ahead and potentially make measurements offshore, although not very many of these transoceanic cables, unless they've been partially severed, are actually dark in the sense that these are used a lot more effectively. But one of the neat things about it is that it's available in urban and rural environments, and it basically can fill up a lot of space. So the biggest strength of using this as a sensing commodity is that it has global reach and high density. Now the challenge is, and if you're familiar with seismology, which I don't know how many geologists we have in the audience, maybe we have one? Okay. So one of the big problems when you install seismometers is knowing exactly what the condition the instrument is installed with. And with fiber, you basically have no idea in most of the cases. Nobody remembers what conduit and how deep the trench was and all of the different pieces of information. So that really is what we thought the challenge would be, and it ended up being the case. So luckily, though, so one of the challenges in general, though, is that even though this is ubiquitous, it's not always easy as a scientist to get access and information about how to use this resource. So luckily, I ran into some folks at ESNet, which is our own internal user facility, which manages high-performance fiber optic communication between the supercomputing centers and the different data-generating resources within DOE. So things like light sources and neutron sources. So they focus on shoveling data as fast as possible between 2 points. But it turns out that they also maintain a network of dark fiber across the US just to test new communication protocols. So I'm like, if they have all this dark fiber in the ground, we're a seismologist, we want to give this a shot. So we connected up with them, and we got access to a couple of their dark fiber sections, which are in California. This is the first time I think they've actually used any of their network for sensing rather than data communications. But so it was kind of a nice combination where we were able to connect up. So we're exploiting the California and Nevada network right here, and this is just a map of a couple of the sections, for this type of experiments. So now I'm going to talk about so now you know the lay of the land, distributed acoustic sensing, a way of making seismic measurements on fiber. We have access to this neat dark fiber resource, and the question now is what we can do with it. So our first experiment was looking at the response of a section of dark fiber which runs from West Sacramento up to Woodland, and this is what we call FOSSA. And so this transitions between kind of the urban area around Sacramento up here to Woodland, and then through some rural areas which might be interested from the point of view of aquifer management stuff. So it was really, when we went into this project, there was really unknown coupling. We didn't know what kind of data we would get, what we'd be able to retrieve. But the two things we really wanted to try to pull out of this, first is I spent a lot of time working on ambient noise seismology, which is where you take noise and you correlate it together to get pictures of what's happening underground, or at least structural estimates. We wanted to see whether we could use that, do that processing approach on this type of dark fiber. And we also wanted to see whether we could see regional and teleseismic events, so whether it could be used for earthquake seismology. So, and that's really was the big question going into this project. So there was a lot of reasons why this was attractive. It was physically close enough we could shuttle data around, and it turns out this technology generates huge volumes of data, as you might guess, because when you're recording on 12,000 channels at 100 kilohertz, or 1,000 kilohertz actually in this case, then you generate data. We basically generate a 16 terabyte hard drive pair every week if we run it at full blast. And so my office right now is full of hard drives. I think I have a picture a little bit later in here in the presentation. So, so there are a lot of advantages to doing it at this little location, but one of the main reasons also is that there's a lot of hydrologic variation going on here, because you have a lot of coupling to river activity, and then also aquifer pumping and irrigation, which is going on in the same section. So this is the layout of the fiber. So one of the interesting things too is we got to figure out where all these fibers connect to. I didn't realize what we'd get into, but the place where all of the networking systems live are called these points of presence. So we installed our Recordic system here in the point of presence, and we actually ran it from July of 2017 up until a week or two ago, and when we had to pull it. But this is just showing the DAS system being installed and the kind of place where all the switches which run the internet live. So the first, immediately when we started recording, we saw a lot of interesting stuff. So one of the interesting things is that you can actually see vehicle movement along the entire array. So this is an example of a freight train, which is slow moving and moving across our array, which we're recording the vibrations from. You can see a lot of car traffic. The majority of the noise it seems like it's related to infrastructure use. And this freight train is like an amazing source of surface waves too. So it was really interesting to start looking at some of the raw data. This is just an example if you zoom in to these vibration measurements as a function of time. This is over, half a kilometer looking at the surface waves from the train. This is a car which is traversing a section of the array. Actually, when we started out in the project too, we wanted to know what the train schedule was. So we called the freight train operator who was there, and they actually have a plus or minus 2-hour window when they send these trains out. We generated a train timetable from looking at the seismic noise generated by their vehicle, and now it's probably more accurate than anything they have on hand because we've processed that for the last 6 months. So this is an example of actually looking at that train traveling back and forth. So this is the Sacramento side, this is the Woodland side, and this is this large freight train moving across the array, and you can see the large order vibrations. So one of the other interesting things about this particular section is we got very, very detailed information on how the fiber was installed. And for those of you who've worked on public infrastructure projects, it was installed in a different way over every 10-foot section, it felt like. We got 600 PDFs worth of engineering designs for all of the sections here. But about half is actually trenched. And then a lot of sections are in horizontal borings to get underneath railroad tracks and roads. So we're in this ongoing analysis effort to try to figure out how that impacts the seismic recording. So now I'm going to show the actual results. So one of the techniques we've been working on for the last several years is called ambient noise seismology. And the idea is you take random seismic noise and you do some signal processing tricks, and you end up getting synthetic seismograms, which look like what it would look like if you had a source at one location, a more controlled geometry. And then from that, you can actually analyze the velocity of different waves and build models of soil structure. And this is a model of shear wave velocity as a function of depth. So this is useful because it means that we can go ahead and take the noise which we record on these fibers to actually build local structural models. And so there are some limits to this, but if anyone's interested, I can talk about that in detail. So we went ahead and we applied this processing technique to every section along one sort of high quality section of the array. And we've ended up, the result is that you take this random noise, you generate these synthetic gathers, you do analysis and get surface wave maps. But this is a map of soil structure to a depth of about 70 meters, which is all taken from the random noise which was acquired as part of this project and recorded on fiber. So from that, you can estimate VS30, which is actually a really important geotech parameter to look at soil ground motion. You can also do things like, potentially if there's a seismic contrast, look at things like water table variations. I can talk about that in a little bit more detail, but that's a little bit squirrely. So this is an example just showing all of those sections we imaged using the fiber optic array. And these are kind of different soil interfaces which were obtained from driller logs and groundwater level at a nearby sampling well. And we were actually able to go ahead and build a pretty comprehensive picture of soil structure along the array. And one interesting kind of updip in the silty clay layer, which you can see, it actually extends farther out. We have some other processed results now. So, and then, in addition to being able to use this ambient noise seismology and tell stuff about soil structure, we've been able to go ahead and make some reasonable measurements of seismic wave fields. Now, this is a little bit of a precursor. When this whole project started out, people weren't clear that you could actually do low-frequency seismic measurements on fiber, and so we showed a bunch of different comparisons on other arrays pretty recently showing that you could, and these are just from other arrays. And so this is the first observation we had off of our dark fiber array. And this is the Mexico M8.1, which was last September. And so one of the neat things about this is the P is out here, it's pretty small. This is S, and this is the surface wave train coming. And one of the really neat things, which we didn't realize beforehand, is that there's sensitivity in these very low frequency ranges in 50 to 100 seconds on this type of recording technique. So we're able to do a good job at recording large teleseismic events. And this is something which more of you will be familiar with. Who was around in January? This was the 4.4, which woke me up, and I grabbed my kids and we went under the door frame because we thought it was the Hayward going, but it turned out not to be. But this is the 4.4. I really, as a parent, you really wake up to that moment, that first shake, and as a seismologist, I thought it was the P hitting, and I'm like, we got to get down before the S hits, And so this is the Berkeley 4.4 showing again the P and S arrivals, and these are trains and trucks actually superimposed on the actual event. So you can see them both superimposed. And usually seismologists actually don't look at data in this way, because usually you have one seismograph which is giving you the information, and here suddenly you've got 12,000 channels. So there's a lot of interesting things which come from looking at data at this resolution.
So this is still that fiber optic transect from Sacramento?
Exactly, yeah. So that's what we've been working on for the pretty much the last year. So, and this is just looking at individual filtered sections from 0.1 to 50 hertz out to the different lower frequencies. There's not very much lower frequency stuff associated with this earthquake because it was relatively small. So now we're starting to actually do some more quantitative sensitivity tests too on the array, and we're using kind of zones which have had large foreshocks and big aftershock sequences. And so luckily during the time we were recording, there's been this big sequence out in Mendocino near the Triple Junction. It started with a 5.1, and there's been a bunch of different 4s and 3s since then. So we're starting to kind of try to evaluate what the sensitivity of the fiber is. This is where our array is, and these are kind of some events over 3, or no, actually, these are all events for a small window of time. So it looks like we can look at larger events, but the smaller events, it's starting to fall on the noise floor, and we're probably going to require some more exotic processing techniques to extract. So data acquisition is only part of the puzzle in this case. So the DAS volumes are so large that we've now filled up something like 1/4 of a petabyte worth of RAID space with the data acquired as part of this project. And it's so large, it's actually even difficult to move back and forth. I have students going out every week to collect boxes of hard drives. And so we're running into some limitations there. And this isn't the only project we have. We have 4 of these DAS units in the field at any given time. And we're getting close to, we'll have a petabyte of data from these different installations this year. So it's really not sustainable with the way we're currently processing, storing, and thinking about data. So we're looking in the future to kind of try to connect up both ESNet for data transport and then potentially storage and analysis at the supercomputing center. And that's kind of the long-term view of how we're going to handle this. But it's really a much larger challenge than we initially had thought about. Intellectually, I knew how many bytes were coming in, but I never tried to actually move 1/4 of a petabyte of data between 2 machines. And so we're also really interested in what we can do with urban fiber infrastructure. Most of the stuff I've been showing has been from the Sacramento transect, which is largely stuff out in a rural area. Actually, in the very beginning of this project, we acquired a couple weeks of data on a section of fiber which runs from Building 50 up at the lab out to the old Nurse warehouse out in Oakland, which is interesting because it crosses the Hayward right about here. And so we really didn't know what to make of the data. It looked so trashy that we had a hard time understanding. And so we actually moved to Sacramento, partially because it was a much more well-defined and easy to process geology. But now we're going back to this data set and trying to understand what we can extract from it. On that, we had 12 kilometers. A lot of it almost looked like no signal. There were parts which looked like they were visible with seismic data and parts which were dominated by BART or Amtrak traffic. So now we're going back to this data set to try to really explore, given what we know now about installation conditions, what we can pull from kind of really urban infrastructure. And there's so much of this going in Berkeley. I'm waiting for the fiber to be trenched over next to our house. Most of that's not going to be dark initially, but we're kind of looking forward to seeing how it can be used in city centers as well. So, we're sort of looking for approaches to try to better understand the coupling between fiber and our measurements. We're also looking at environmental information we can pull from dark fiber beyond kind of surface wave velocities, which I showed. We think we can actually use diurnal temperature fluctuation to get information on soil moisture because of thermomechanical coupling into the fiber. We're trying also to look at deep aquifer properties using longer transect ambient noise studies. We also really want to understand how earthquake seismic measurements on dark fiber can be really effectively utilized. One interesting approach would be to use it for earthquake early warning, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's going ahead and making P-wave measurements and giving people 10 seconds of time before the destructive surface wave hits. But because dark fiber is in so many places, it seems like a natural application. We're also interested in more accurate hypocenters for small local events and information on small events in zones of really poor network coverage. So the Sacramento Basin is a good example where there's a lot of fluid extraction and injection from oil and gas activities, particularly gas in the Sacramento Basin. But there are no seismometers there, so nobody knows what kind of seismic activity is associated with those injections. So we're kind of interested in the induced seismicity angle. And then finally, we're kind of interested in how we can use these different resources beyond the prior topics. Transit sensing is one, pipe leakage is another, so there are so many possibilities. Once you start acquiring this data, there's new stuff which comes out of it just because you have it in such large density across large transects. So we're excited about the technology, and that's it. So the early work was funded by the Department of Defense, but most of the work I've shown today is from our lab-directed research and development program. Thanks. Any questions?
Okay. Let's thank Jonathan for his presentation. Any comments or questions to follow up? Okay. Diz?
You, in the FOSSA experiment, you jumped over a little bit the top of the water table. You said it was squirrely data.
So the squirrely part, so this is the squirrely part. If you look at the basic rock physics, you don't expect actually shear wave velocity to be that sensitive to water content. because it shouldn't change the shear modulus of soils. But sometimes it changes the cohesiveness of clays, and so you can see that in S-wave velocity. So the squirrely part of it is that the basic rock physics sort of would suggest that it's not detectable, but sort of from experience and looking at a lot of shear wave data sets, you can often see that transition zone from clay cohesion. So that's the squirrely part, is that you wouldn't expect it assuming Gassman, which is the standard theory.
So railroads spend a lot of time worrying about the viability of their rolling stock when they're using it.
Oh yeah.
For flat wheels and bearings that are going bad. I wonder if this technology could be used. Might be able to sell it to the railroads only because, if there was a signal that you could see for a bad wheel or a bad bearing.
Yeah.
And you could see it. They spent a lot of time worried about that.
I totally agree. I didn't even know about that application. Still, I started, sort of delving into the train timetable stuff, and then I started just doing some random searches. And there are companies which are marketing somewhat similar technologies, but not effectively processed to do just that. So, but the fact that this is telecom fiber and wasn't actually even installed for monitoring railroads in the first place is kind of the selling point for this type of application. Yeah. It turns out that for fiber optics, a lot of them are run in existing right-of-ways. So a lot of them are clustered around highways and rail lines. So it's a perfect application to use the existing telecom for monitoring the railways.
So on earthquakes, could if you had a big enough array, big enough in the sense of geographically dispersed, you'll have to remind me. So when the Loma Prieta earthquake began, what was the transit time for the P wave between Loma Prieta and San Francisco?
You're gonna have to. It's the force of the Nicene Marks was the epicenter, so it was like maybe 50 kilometers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm gonna guess for the 4 kilometers per second. So maybe 10, 15 seconds for the P wave, and then, like in between, it's, roughly double that for the S and surface wave train. So maybe there's 15 seconds difference. I'm just guessing. That's not without doing any modeling.
Okay. Yeah. So, but it's order of magnitude.
Yeah, order of magnitude. So, and typically that's what they try to do is have a network station as close to the rupture zone as possible, and that's what's provide the information which will be forward telegraphed to the rest of the network. To a big P wave is or a big S wave is coming. Here's your extra bit of time. The problem with some of those techniques is they require a lot of centralization, so you can process that piece of data the moment it hits the seismograph, and we're nowhere near that for this type of instrumentation. So, but I think that would be the nice thing about fiber for that application is that it's because it's almost anywhere. There's a high likelihood you'll have it close to where the hypocenter actually is. So it could be useful from that perspective because it isn't dependent on the current network geometry. You have a much broader network.
Any other comments, questions?
Great, thanks a lot.
Okay, once again, thank you, Jonathan. I think we are ready to move out to our CAG member update. So any news items of interest to the CAG from our CAG members, first of all. So Jody.
Yeah, hi. I just want to let folks know that on April 19th is Rising Sun's big annual fundraiser where the lab is a wonderful sponsor of that event. And it's a really fun event to get to know about the deep work we do with people in the community around climate change and economic equity, as well as have great food and music and a fun time. So I'll send out something maybe to this group that you guys can all know about and come to the event. It's at the Ed Roberts campus.
Okay, Kirsten.
Hi, so wanted to let everyone know that the Chamber launched a new program at the end of last year, the Women Entrepreneurs of Berkeley, and it's been a huge success so far. All of our events have been sold out. Our last one was down at the LB&L site on Potter Street, and it was an all-female founder panel talking about transitioning from academia to industry and biotech. there are 150 people that signed up to come, and it was a fabulous event. And we have another one coming up where everyone can come from here. It's free to attend, and we're doing a Women's History Month meetup featuring Arlene Bloom, and I'm not sure, Diz, you may know her. She's a very kind of famous activist from Berkeley. She also led the first successful ascent, happened to be with an all-woman team up Annapurna. And she also did amazing science policy work in the 70s, getting certain toxins labeled and taken out of consumer products. So she's gonna be talking to us at the Old Women's Club, the Berkeley City Club, Morgan's Bar, which is a new bar that they've opened, on March 28th, which is a Wednesday, from 5 to 7:30. I can actually send the flyer with our Eventbrite link to everybody in this group. And let's see, anything else coming up? We have a Berkeley Today and Tomorrow luncheon, which is our annual luncheon. Happens also to be at the Berkeley City Club, but I swear we do things at other places. And this year, we're featuring Nancy Skinner and Scott Wiener talking about SB 827. Not sure if any of you know about SB 827, but it's a very courageous bill by our colleagues up in Sacramento that is trying to expedite affordable housing creation. So anything that's also relevant to this group, it's going to fast track transit-rich properties that have residential and affordable units being developed on it, so they don't have to deal with a lot of the entitlement process and review processes that slow down a lot of projects, sometimes for years, especially in Berkeley. So we're going to hear a presentation from Scott and Nancy on that. We have Leslie from the Turner Center up at Cal moderating the discussion, and of course there's going to be some feedback from the community. So that's going to be on May 4th at the Berkeley City Club. And yeah, if anyone's ever interested in learning more about the upcoming chamber events or our new programs, just give me your card and I can make sure that you're on the chamber newsletter and you'll get all of these. So thanks.
Fantastic. Okay. Any other questions or comments? The next on the bottom of your agenda, the next CAG meeting is June 11th. Please make note. Okay. Any other items? Then hearing none, let's wrap it up for this evening. All right. Thank you, everybody.